Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics, and I'm pleased to welcome Benny Peiser. He is the director of Net Zero Watch. He is based in London. Benny, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
This is a special episode of the Power Hungry Podcast, and we're going to talk about Ukraine. Benny, I did not warn you, but guests introduce themselves on this podcast. You have a long CV. You're also affiliated with the Global Warming Policy Foundation. But imagine, if you don't mind, that you've arrived somewhere, you don't know anyone, you have about 60 seconds to introduce yourself. Please do so.
Well, I'm the director of the Global Warming Policy Foundation, which is a education charity on energy and climate policy, which was founded about 12 and a half years ago by Lord Lawson, who was the treasurer under Margaret Thatcher, a very senior British politician, instrumental in privatizing after the disaster of the 70s, 80s, privatizing large chunks of the British industry. And Net Zero Watch is our campaigning arm. So we have two arms, and I'm speaking on behalf of Net Zero Watch because we're not talking here about educational issues. We're talking about political issues and energy and policy in particular.
Okay, good. And you are based in London?
Our office is in London. I'm today talking to you from home, which is in Liverpool, but our office is in London, and I tend to work most of the time at home and in London.
Gotcha. Liverpudlian? What is the name for a Liverpool?
Yes, either that or Scouser.
Okay.
I'm an honorary Scouser. I'm originally from Germany, so I've been in Britain for 30 years, so I know the German situation, energy situation very well. I've seen it for over the last 45 years. And what we're talking today, the crisis in Ukraine, is a direct result of what originated in Germany in the 1980s.
Well, let's talk about that then, because from what I see, I was just checking the spot prices for gas in Europe. The Dutch trading hub TTF, the front month price is $52. The spot price here in the U.S. at Henry Hub is less than $5. So, it looks like Europe is in just a total energy crisis that there is no way out of in anything like the near term. That's my view. How do you see it? How bad is it, and how long will it last?
It is very bad. There is no short-term answer, although there are, still ways of, reducing the enormous dependency on Russian energy imports. And we're not talking only gas, we're talking everything, oil and coal. Europe currently is spending 700 million euros every day just for Russian gas. So Europe is funding Putin's war to the tune of 700 million euros every day. And this is just for gas. We're not even talking here the coal imports, which are also very substantial, and of course oil as well. So we have a huge problem. And of course, the reason why Putin thinks he can afford to invade a sovereign country like Ukraine is because he thinks Europe is unable to do anything about it. And it looks almost as if Europe is unable to do much about it. So the energy dependency on Russia is absolutely staggering. And of course, it all started about 30, 40 years ago with the campaign first against nuclear energy, which many European countries have phased out nuclear altogether, have stopped building new nuclear power plants. So nuclear, the percentage of nuclear in the energy mix has shrunk significantly. Then the next stage was to go after coal, which obviously was the mainstay for many countries. That drove the Industrial Revolution and so on. So the coal phase out was next. And the idea was to go for for renewable energy. And that requires, of course, then a lot of gas. And so gas demand has gone through the roof. And in particular, the demand for Russian gas has gone through the roof. And so that is the background to the current situation. It's all self-inflicted.
I think that's exactly right. I've thought about it, and I've written headlines about this, that this is Europe's own energy suicide. Is that the right phrase? You say self-inflicted. I mean, if you were if you're writing a headline, or you're just trying to make this as succinct as possible, what's the right phrase for this?
The right phrase, in my opinion, is unilateral energy disarmament. If you remember, in the 60s and 70s, the left called for unilateral nuclear disarmament, that, Europe and the US should give up nuclear weapons, and then we would have global peace.
Right.
So what we've done in Europe is unilaterally disarmed our energy, and we are naked in front of a big oppressor and aggressor, and have essentially no weapons left in this energy war.
It's staggering, the situation, and as you say, and that there's been no effort to cut off the gas or to punish Putin in terms of the cutting off the flow of energy, although the UK has now announced it won't import any more Russian oil, gas, or coal. Is that correct?
That's correct. But Britain, fortunately, is less dependent on Russian energy imports than most other European countries. Because Britain still has domestic oil and gas production in the North Sea. And B, the imports that we get are mainly from Norway and the Middle East. So the exposure to Russia is comparatively small. So we can afford to, ban Russian energy imports. Germany essentially would have to more or less close down if they wouldn't get the energy from Russia, because they are so dependent. And other countries are almost 100% dependent on Russia. Quite a lot of European nations are dependent on, sorry for that. I'm very sorry.
No problem.
So yes, Britain can afford to do that. And in fact, Britain has now the opportunity and the duty to actually increase gas supplies, not just for the British economy, but for the European economy, and help Europe out of this misery. But it would require to lift the really foolish and ridiculous moratorium or ban on fracking, which the Greens and the Russians managed to, with their propaganda, managed to enforce. So the Green movement essentially is reaping now the rewards of 40 years of anti-nuclear and anti-fossil fuel propaganda in empowering Putin. And that is the direct result of 30, 40 years of Green propaganda. And the Russians obviously have helped tremendously with their own Western TV and radio stations, who have helped the Greens enormously over the years.
Propaganda, I think that is the right word, though, isn't it?
Well, that's what they're using. It's not kind of rational arguments where you weigh up the pros and the cons, where you say, well, there are some risks, but there are many benefits, and you look at it from both sides. They only say this is dangerous, we can't afford, it's killing the planet, and so on. So they know exactly how to play this game, and they have succeeded. Because essentially, the Russians, hand in hand with the Greens, have succeeded to disarm Europe. when it comes to energy, completely disarm it. And we have to rearm ourselves. We have to, a bit like in the late 30s, when Britain was realizing how they were tricked into believing that, they didn't want another conflict. Well, if you want to survive in the neighborhood of a aggressive bully who is willing to use weapons indiscriminately, then you have, if you want peace, you have to prepare for war.
Let's talk about fracking just a moment. We're recording on March 4th, Friday. I just saw your email note that just went out. And again, my guest is Benny Peiser. He's the director of Net Zero Watch. You can find his work at netzerowatch.com. Your email blast saying that the former head of MI6, Sir Richard Dearlove, has called on Boris Johnson to, I'm quoting here, immediately lift the moratorium on fracking. So how important is it that Dearlove is saying this, that MI6 is your intelligence service similar to our CIA? How important is this? And second, how soon could the UK change course and get some drilling rigs actually running?
Well, first of all, it's absolutely important that he has come out very strongly now to make the case that everything has changed. The invasion of Ukraine and the war against Ukraine is currently changing energy policy across Europe, and nothing will remain the same. 30 years of energy policy have been bombed to smithereens, have been destroyed within a few days. And of course, politicians have to reconsider, reassess. In some parts of Europe, they are thinking of going back to coal. Whereas here in Britain, we're not thinking going back to coal. Although, if the energy minister continues to oppose shale development, then sooner or later people will be calling for a return to coal, because something has to give. And so it's very important that the former head of MI6 has come out. He also said that the current policy are unrealistic and unachievable, these green net zero policies. Very important. So we really have to totally reassess the situation and have to make significant changes, realistic changes to energy policy. You ask how long would it take? I'm told by Quadrilla, the company that started to frack in the north of England.
And Quadrilla has leases, and they've proved up, some very significant resources, shale resources. They haven't done enough drilling to call them reserves yet, but the shale the shale gas potential in Britain is quite large.
It's massive, absolutely massive. So just to give you an idea, the shale basins in Britain are roughly 10 times deeper than the average shale basin in the US. 10 times deeper. So we don't obviously know how much of it is commercially extractable, because we haven't done enough test drilling. But the potential is significant. Though the low estimate is that it's the Boland shale basin alone might be good enough for 50 years of gas consumption at current levels, 50 years. But this is a low estimate. It might be less, it might be more, but the potential is absolutely enormous. And the fracking moratorium or ban is absolutely ridiculous and self-defeating. And the cost crisis, and we haven't even spoken about the cost crisis, will sooner or later, in combination with the geopolitical crisis over Ukraine, will fairly soon force the government to open up shale, because otherwise they will just help Putin. Right. And they will be seen as helping Putin, just like Joe Biden and his ridiculous anti-fossil fuel policies is clearly helping Putin in his war effort. So all these anti-pipeline, anti-shale, anti-fossil fuel governments will come under enormous public pressure to ease the cost burden and the political risk that we're currently facing.
So you don't mind me saying this just directly because I've followed your work for a long time and admired your dedication to this, but I can't help but notice that there's a real anger in how you're talking about this.
Of course, people are beginning to realize that, we've been saying this essentially for the last 10, 12 years. This is not something new. We set up in 2009, just in the run up to the Copenhagen Climate Summit. And we've been saying, and we've never said anything that, that climate change isn't happening or there's no greenhouse. We've always focused on the policies and the cost. We always have said that the cost of the risk of the policies are bigger than the risk we face from climate change. And so we're very, very consistent, and you can go back, and look at our webpage and our publications. It's always been the same. And we've warned that also of the geopolitical risk, because we realized that the only countries that actually made an effort to decarbonize and to move away from cheap fossil fuels were Western countries. China and Russia and other countries in Asia, they prioritized economic growth and their security, energy security issue, whereas we prioritized the green agenda. And we said, under these circumstances, it is self-defeating, because obviously the CO2 is just shifted to other parts of the world. We're not actually addressing CO2 emissions. We're just shifting it to parts of the world where there are less stringent regulations. So the whole exercise has been, as I said, unilateral disarmament, and it has, of course, not stopped CO2 emissions from rising. It has just made the Western world much, much less effective, competitive, and weak, very weak. And people don't understand the importance of reliable and cheap energy in their both economic strength and their security. People totally understand. And now we are beginning to learn the lesson that we've made 30 years. We were, most of European countries were totally naive to trust the Russians and to think, give them almost a hold over our security.
So I'm asking you about that again, because just the tone, I've done now 100 podcasts or so, and I guess I've been a reporter for a long time, but it's so, I pay a lot of attention to the tone of your voice. And I'm only bringing this up because you're being proven right, but you're pissed about you're mad about being proven correct here, because the warning signs were clear. Is that, am I reading your tone here? It's not about you, but I just feel that I've been saying some of these same things as well, but it's just the disaster now that's unfolding in Ukraine, with Europe seemingly unable to respond in any way that's meaningful. It's flabbergasting.
Well, it's not that flabbergasting, because this, as I said, is a process that has been going on for at least 30 years.
Right.
This is nothing new. And it's just now people are beginning to realize just what fatal mistakes have been made. And, it would be foolish of me just to be angry and to say, well, we've told you so, and, and that's it.
Sure.
We are really trying to come up with practical and realistic solutions to this problem. We've actually published alternative options, energy policy options that are pragmatic and realistic in the short and in the medium term, but it requires governments to completely revise energy policy and completely abandon the priority of net zero and the green agenda. As long as the governments think that the green agenda tops everything, they will be unable to come to a more pragmatic and more realistic energy policy agenda. And so they now have to, basically, they have to decide, are we going to protect our economy? Are we going to protect our countries? Are we going to protect our people? Or are we going to protect the green lobby? That's the whole thing. It boils down to that.
Do you see that happening in the U.S.? I mean, I don't know if you saw Biden's speech in the State of the Union the other night. Do you think that they've understood this? Or, I mean, what I heard...
No, of course not. But at least in the US, you have a partisan situation. In Europe, there's this all-party consensus. All parties are saying, basically, all parties are more or less Biden. So we don't have a Republican Party in Europe that says, this is crazy. We need to be realistic about our, energy security, our national security. We don't have that. Everyone is banging on that we have to save the planet and forget about energy security and forget about the economy and forget about the security of our nation. We have to be Greta Thunberg. So that kind of cult, and it is a cult, I think is on the verge of being bombed to reality. And what happens at the afterwards, once people realize that this was a crazy cult and we have to wake up and sobering up, that I think we're close to that, but we're not there yet.
Not sober yet, still a little drunk.
Yeah.
So who's to blame here? Name names for me, if you don't mind. I mean, who were the groups? Name them, please. Who were the groups and the most aggressive leaders of this policy in Europe and in Britain that led Europe into this trap that clearly Putin had laid for Europe? Who? Name names, if you don't mind.
Well, to be frank, it actually started... I mean, we have had the environmental prophets of doom ever since the 60s.
Sure.
The Paul Ehrlichs in the US, and we had the same kind of people in Europe. And they never really had a significant impact on policy because of the Cold War and the conflict between, the free European Western countries and the Soviet Union. Now, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the kind of intellectual collapse of communism and socialism, the left turned to environmentalism. And environmentalism, and I observed that, and I was actually part of the environmental movement in the late 70s, early 80s, and I was, part of that transition to environmentalism. And the key attack initially was on nuclear energy, long before climate change came up. The fear of, nuclear energy being a, risk to our health and to our society and so on. But environmentalism essentially became an ideology, replacing socialism or Marxism. And when I say it's a cult, it's an ideology where everything you do, everything you think, everything you eat is dominated by the thought of the environment. So you no longer weigh up the pros and the cons. You no longer weigh up the costs and the benefits, because only the green agenda is what is important to your policies. Now, the green parties became fairly powerful in the 1980s, and the mainstream parties responded to that by becoming green. All mainstream parties. So that's what I'm saying. It's very different in the US.
So in the UK, the Labour and the Tories both signed on to this agenda, whereas you're saying still in the US, there's been a little bit more balance of power, but the Democrats have been in my view, and I'm not a Democrat, not a Republican, I'm disgusted, but it's that they fully embrace this green agenda and the anti-nuclear activist, climate activist agenda. And but who are the groups then that led the charge in Europe? Tell me who they are?
Party, the Green movements,
the Green Party in Germany.
The Green movement in Europe turned from a kind of anti-nuclear, nuclear power movement, with demonstrations into parties.
Right.
And parties gained support significantly. They went into government. Some countries had to made coalitions with the Green parties, and their price for being part of a government, particularly in Germany, was to say, well, we will only be part of the government as a coalition partner if you agree to phase out nuclear energy. So it started with nuclear energy in the 80s, and all the mainstream parties then became anti-nuclear in Germany. And then in the 90s, it turns to fossil fuels. And when you first, go against nuclear and then against coal and gas, there's not much left to power your country. The other irony or tragedy, depending on how you look at it, is the kind of naive utopian belief that you can power an industrial society with solar and wind. So the idea was we can get rid of all the power plants, replace them with wind turbines and solar panels, and of course eventually we'll have the batteries and we can store all the energy when the wind doesn't blow or it's night or so on. Now of course that hasn't happened, and so you need still all the backup for the renewables, which makes this demand for gas so important, because basically the gas-fired power plants are the backup for the renewables, and that caused all sorts of economic and technological problems, because the gas-fired power plants are not running effectively or efficiently,
sure.
And that makes them very much more expensive, and also
very similar. Very similar. Go ahead.
You were asking who is responsible. And the answer is that we, as a society in Europe, and we're talking here, it's mainly a European phenomenon, but it has spread to other parts of the Western world, like Australia, Canada, parts of the US. There are two reasons. One is that the Europeans thought, we don't have that much oil. We don't have that much gas, so perhaps it's a good idea if we go to renewables. That was one major reason for the Europeans to think it might actually be a good idea to move away from fossil fuels. Nuclear never made sense, never. And that was total irrational fear-mongering. But we have to accept, I think, that as a society, the old kind of traditional ideas of stability and risk went out of the window in the last 30, 40 years. And in Europe, the most intellectuals, academics, and politicians have chosen to exaggerate the fear and exaggerate the risk. And that,
and you're speaking about climate change here, or climate change and nuclear radiation from nuclear plants.
And they've overestimated the risk from climate change and from nuclear energy, and underestimated the risk of making yourself vulnerable as a result of your policies.
Right.
And now they are beginning to realize that, you always have to weigh up. Whatever you do comes with a risk. And they've underestimated the political risk of being so exposed to Russia.
And that political risk, but it's the economic risk as well, right? Because now you're facing just this massive increase in prices. What are the price increases for most British ratepayers now went up by 52%? Is that right now? That has just taken effect in the last few weeks?
Yeah, but in the last 12 months, it has doubled.
So the average consumer, including you in Liverpool, you're facing electricity and gas bills that are 2x what they were a year ago.
Yeah, and by the end of the year, it will be so it will be 3 times more expensive than a year ago.
By the end of this year,
yeah,
what you will be paying, your household energy bill will be 3 times what it was last year.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's staggering. I mean, it's just staggering. And
this is one of the reasons why I don't think this net zero agenda, this green agenda, will survive.
That this has to be, the rationality has to prevail, because now that, it's being forced upon Europe.
Yeah, and any government that fails to, respond to that kind of hit, that, and it's a hit that not only households experience. I mean, every business.
Right. I saw your note about the pubs, and now you're getting close to my heart here. When the pubs are facing their increase in energy costs was £800 million in an increase in just the last few months. Tell me about that, if you don't mind.
Well, of course, not only the pubs, every restaurant, every business that has to heat their, and or has a high energy bill, if you can pass it on, fine. Like, a big shopping centers will just put up the prices and pass on the increase. But some businesses can't pass on the cost, because no one is going to come and drink a beer that is twice as expensive as last year. So half of the pubs basically face ruin if they don't get any support. So the whole economy is facing these enormous hits, and that's one of the reasons why and it was already bad before the Russians invaded Ukraine. Now it's going mad. So as I said, for the first time in 30 years, governments around Europe are beginning to realize that they can't continue business as usual. Everything has changed, and everything will have to change.
And that starts with getting some drill rigs running in the shale basins in England, and right damn quick.
Absolutely. That's the first and the easiest. Boris just has to say, we will lift the moratorium, and we are inviting every investor from America, from around the world, who wants to get the gas out of the ground to come to England. We will pave the way. We will not put up artificial hurdles and blockades. And I'm told that it would take roughly 12 months to start the gas coming out of the ground.
Well, I think they're, from what my understanding of the rig count in the U.S., it's about half of what it was, 2 or 3 years ago. There should be some available drill rigs, but you're going to have to get them over there on ships, and you're going to need some Texans and some Oklahoma guys to come over, some roughnecks to come over there and operate them. And but the technology and the personnel are available. But you're saying the political will is going to be available now as well.
Absolutely, and in the past, the government has put all these hurdles and regulatory problems, and it was absolutely, difficult to actually frack. They have to get rid of all of this, and to make absolutely sure that people who want to get it out of the ground are not blockaded or hindered by ridiculously, exaggerated regulations. So that's a challenge. And as I said, my own view is, if the government doesn't do that, then they are basically toast. There's no chance.
Is Boris toast anyway? Boris Johnson, is he out anyway with the, he's been a remarkably wily politician. Remarkably durable. But is this combined with his, what was the scandals at the Downing Street parties and COVID and everything? But this is far more important than that. But is this? Do you think he stays in power, or does that? It's maybe
for
not
the time being, yes. Not least because of the war in Ukraine, and
right.
He plays a very important role in rallying, the Western world He plays a really important role. And but as I said, if he can't solve the energy cost crisis, I doubt he will survive. That's the challenge he has on his hands, because it will damage the economy and it will hit families to such an extent that they can't really heat their homes anymore.
So we're talking about consumers mainly, but the other part of this is the deindustrialization of Europe, which was starting already last fall when the prices were spiking and you saw fertilizer plants closing, metal aluminum smelters, other kind of industrial plants were shutting down because the costs were so high, both for nat gas and for electricity. But the capital is mobile, and so does this accelerate the deindustrialization of Britain and the rest of Europe?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And this has been a long process. I mean, part of the, decarbonization of Europe was that most of the energy-intensive industries, the heavy industries, just went to other parts of the world. And what Europe has done is to say, look how green we are. So instead of producing the stuff in Europe, it's being, let's say, produced in China.
Right.
We then import these goods from China and say, look, we're not emitting any CO2. But of course, people don't realize that the CO2 was emitted in China and that all we've done is shifted it, abroad.
Sure.
We haven't reduced CO2. We have only shifted it to other parts of the world. We're importing essentially the products from China that were produced there, and the emissions have gone up there. But, the atmosphere doesn't care where the CO2 goes up.
Well, so let's talk about renewables for a moment, because I've, as you may know, I've very closely tracked the issue of land use and land use constraints in Europe and in the U.S., and the backlash in the U.S. against the renewable siting in rural areas. I know the European Platform Against Wind, it's epaw.org. I think in 2010 they had 400 members. Now they have something like 1,600 member organizations across Europe. So as I see it, and I'm going to just give you my quick brief here, but it's just that the big lie, and it's been a lie, I mean, just a falsehood, a whopper of enormous in dimensions, was that, we'll just put all these renewables, all this stuff out there in the countryside, and there's plenty of vacant land out there that we can put this stuff on, and, wind turbines, solar panels, et cetera, and also the transmission lines. So I've shown you my bias, you're familiar with what I've done. That's a lot of what I've written about. But tell me about what, the situation in Scotland, in Ireland, in Britain on the siting both of large scale wind projects and of transmission lines. What is the situation with those, the land use conflicts there, please?
Right. So, I mean, that is different from country to country.
Right.
Germany in particular is exposed, onshore. The onshore wind turbines are very, very extensive, and a lot of farmers don't actually produce any food anymore. They are farming wind, or let's say they're not farming wind. They are farming wind subsidies.
Right. Well put. Thank you.
In Britain, the situation is that most of the wind development is offshore. But the costs haven't come down significantly, despite all the claims that wind is now cheap. Costs remain fairly high, not least because most of the kind of good locations have been taken. You have to go out, further offshore, deeper waters, more difficult places, and so on. We're currently spending roughly 11 billion pounds in subsidies to developers. That money is being paid directly through our energy bill. So it's not something that the government hands out to the developers. It's something every household, every consumer has to pay via their energy bills.
So I'm sorry, just to interrupt. So that's 11 billion pounds a year for renewables energy subsidies in the UK.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you. And
that doesn't even include the kind of backup mechanisms whereby when there isn't enough wind, you have to, fire up coal-fired power plants or gas power plants. The so-called balance mechanism to make sure that the grid doesn't collapse.
So 11 billion pounds in subsidies alone on ratepayer added to ratepayers' bills. But in addition, there's the balancing costs of just incorporating that
it's
erratic.
Another 3 billion. Roughly.
Another 2 or 3 billion. So you're talking 13, 14 billion pounds per year, all in this added cost to support renewables on the UK grid.
Right. That's right. And of course, without these subsidies, no one would build a wind turbine.
Right.
I mean, there are some companies who are basically doing some deals with a big, business and selling it to a kind of promotional price, if you want.
Right.
Not the official, electricity price.
Sure.
If you, let's say, Apple, and you want to claim, or IKEA, these big companies, we use renewables, then you're ready to pay a lot of money. But it's not the kind of market price. You're paying a kind of PR price. But from a purely economic point,
I like that, the PR price. That's good. I like that.
Well,
It's just well stated the way you just threw it off there. But please go ahead.
Because some proponents of renewables say, but you can't build them without subsidies. Well, you can only build them if someone pays you this PR price or a much, much higher price than the market price.
Right.
On market price, no one would be able to survive without subsidies. And so this whole claim, I mean, this is also a realization among politicians, the claim for the last 30 years that renewables will eventually become competitive and so cheap that they can compete with fossil fuels. That hasn't happened. And, in addition to the cost, you have the insecurity and the kind of the grid stability or instability. And what also people don't understand is that the backup power plants that you need, the gas-fired power plants in particular, that you need to back up the renewables, are both more expensive because they are not longer running efficiently and also more emitting. And we actually showed that if you forget about the renewables and only did nuclear and gas, the gas power plants would emit far less CO2 because they would be running 24/7 instead of up and down and on and off.
Sure.
So all these unintended consequences have added to the destabilization of the national grids, which are very costly to balance and very costly to stabilize. So there are all these unintended consequences of renewables. Basically, renewables are simply, they might work if you only have 10-15% in your energy system, but once they grow, they destabilize the electricity grid and make everything so much more expensive. Right. On top of the subsidies.
Sure. So, I'm in Texas. I'm in the U.S. If I gave you the podium and you were in front of a bunch of American policymakers, both from both parties or whatever, local, national, whatever, what would you tell them?
Oh, that's simple. Incidentally, I'm coming to the U.S. in the second half of March for some speaking events.
Oh, right, with Francis Minton at the Manhattan Contrarian. Yes, he's a prolific writer and remarkable guy. Yeah, I know. I know of him. I haven't met him, but yes, please go ahead.
It's very simple. It's very, very simple. North America, if you include Canada, the U.S., and if you want Mexico, is the energy superpower of the 21st century, if it wants to be. Only if it wants to be. No other part of the world has more energy than North America. If you give away your trump card, don't be surprised if you lose the game. And that's what I would say. It's not that difficult to understand. If you want to, compete, if you want to still compete, I mean, some people in America don't want to compete anymore. They want to basically hand over to China. But if you want to still compete in the game, keep your trump card and don't throw it away. There is no other part in the world which has more energy than North America.
And it's almost, you say it very well, and I appreciate that. It's just in very great clarity. But, I have to, as you said that, I also thought, it's almost accidental how it even happened, the shale revolution, and that George Mitchell and the slick water frack and how that whole process came about. That, lucky accident, I guess, would be more correct. Or, you were in the right place at the right time, but it has been a lot of capital destroyed in the U.S. 300 billion or more in capital was destroyed as the shale revolution matured. But still, we're at a situation now where our natural gas is a tenth of the cost of what is being now paid on the continent, and the electricity prices are a fraction. I mean, this should be a wake up call. I mean, it should be the rankest and most bold kind of wake up call. But I don't know if the Democrats are getting the memo. I was very, very disappointed with Biden's speech the other night because he did not mention nuclear energy one time. So again, my guest is Benny Peiser. He's the director of Net Zero Watch, as well as an affiliated group called the Global Warming Policy Foundation. He's talking to us from Liverpool. You can find more about him at netzerowatch.com and sign up. I recommend signing up for their daily email blasts. So will this accelerate? We've talked about drilling for gas in Britain, and will this accelerate then the approval of the Hinkley Point C project? Because it seems like that has been in limbo now for quite a long time.
No, that's being built.
It's being built. Oh, the nuclear plant has been approved and is being constructed. I thought that was still waiting for final approval.
No, that's gone ahead, but that's not enough. That's, there are 2 or 3 older nuclear power plants that are basically being phased out in the next few years. So we need much more nuclear energy. Europe needs much more nuclear energy. And there is a hope that these small modular reactors might be cheaper and quicker to deploy.
And are they getting any traction? I've written about that here in the U.S., and they face the hurdles with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is a whole other set of issues that I won't go into. But are they? I know Macron in France has mentioned SMRs. Are the French the ones that are going? Rosatom was the leader in this in deploying nuclear. Now no one's going to be looking to them for.
We don't know. The Japanese have done. I think they have one running. In America, a couple of companies. In Britain, it's Rolls-Royce. So we don't know who will achieve, breakthrough or success first. But you have to accelerate this. And you mentioned regulatory hurdles. That's part of the biggest problem for nuclear energy is the high cost due to the regulations.
Right.
And so the regulations are exaggerated. Again, something that is, in my view, political, not justified. Of course, you want safety, and of course it has to be. But we live in, Western nations with very high safety standards, but you have to weigh up the costs and the risks. And if you don't weigh them up, then nothing happens, and you're stuck. We need to accelerate nuclear energy in a big way. I expect this is going to happen in Europe, very similar to when it happened in the oil shock in 1973, and perhaps these smaller modular reactors are hopefully a medium-term solution. In the short term, Europe, I'm afraid, is likely to go back to coal because there is enough coal still, particularly in Germany, in other East and Central European countries. They will not give up coal now that they have had contact with the Russian bear. So in the medium term, a lot of countries will go back to coal. They will relegate the climate agenda. That will be basically on the list of priorities will come down. Energy supply and energy security will become the key issues, the cost issue as well. There is plenty of gas in Europe. Think about the gas reserves in the Mediterranean. I mean, that was the other thing with the Biden administration. They told the Greeks and the Israelis, forget about the pipeline to Europe. We need Turkey. And then a week ago, they're saying we need more natural gas to counter Russia. I mean, they're all over the place.
I want to follow up on that, because I think that's a really critical point, right? About the Biden administration's senseless policies on pipelines, right? They cancel Keystone XL as soon as he comes into power, and then says, oh yeah, Nord Stream 2, okay, no problem. And then they pull the support for the East Med, which is the pipeline from Israel, which now, due to the Leviathan and the Tamar fields, have massive offshore gas resources that may well extend into Lebanon and south into Egypt, and said, oh, we're not going to support that. I mean, just a few weeks before Putin invaded Ukraine. So, I mean, their pipeline policy, I mean, as a friend of mine, a new acquaintance of mine said recently, they have a lot of tactics but no strategy, which I think is the perfect summation of what they're doing. I mean, it just makes no sense whatsoever in terms of any strategic approach to these issues. And so
they're not alone, they're not alone. The Biden administration is a mirror image of the average European government, basically. They're all over the place. They have no idea what they're talking about. The only idea they're banging on is net zero or Green Deal. This is all they can say. That is all they agree upon. What it means, what the consequences are, who cares? There is no clear thinking. There's no rational thinking. And the reason is that all the traditional priorities like national security, energy security, supply security, cost security, all of that has gone out of the window. It's completely ignored because of the Green Deal or the I don't know what it's now called.
Build Back Better.
Build Back Better. Exactly.
Yeah.
Here it's net zero. So that is all they can agree upon. And of course, now, as a result, we are where we are.
Well, I'm sobered up. It's morning here. It's afternoon in Liverpool. Well, just a couple of more questions, if you don't mind, Benny. It's been just great. I really appreciate your passion and your time on talking about these issues, and have followed your work for quite some time. Just a couple of last questions. So you've been thinking about these issues for a long time, and that you've been writing about them for a long time. And unfortunately, now you're being proven right in so many of these things. So what are you reading now? I mean, I know you're doing a lot of media interviews. You're publishing a lot. I've been reading John Constable's essays, by the way, who was a great guest on the Power Hungry podcast a few weeks ago. What are you reading these days?
Reading? Oh,
yes.
I don't read anything about energy or climate. That's for sure.
Okay, well, tell me then. What are you reading? What is on your bookshelf?
Historical. I'm reading a lot about historical situation that resemble our period of intellectual confusion, cultural change.
So give me an example or two, if you don't mind.
Well, think about the Reformation.
Uh-huh.
Think about Martin Luther, just as an example.
Sure.
Right? When he criticized the Catholic Church, the Roman Church, he didn't start by saying, oh, I have a different theology and your theology is, he started by criticizing their policies. You remember in those days, they had a policy, if you put some money into, their church, you could be forgiven for your sins.
Right. The ancient equivalent of the modern carbon indulgence, the carbon credits. Yes.
Exactly. So I'm interested to understand how in previous periods of our history, when confusion reigned and people, their old traditions were challenged and they were confused and they, had all these kind of doomsday predictions and fear mongering and prophets of doom and so on, like we have today. How did philosophers and intellectuals responded? How did they try to overcome it? And how did they try to come up with, solutions to the confusion? That's what I'm interested in. That's my reading. Nothing to do with, obviously day to day I read
Sure.
the news and the papers and, reports, but in the evening when I do some serious reading, I'm more interested in historical periods of similar confusion, trying to understand, also accepting that the mistakes and the confusion we're experiencing are perhaps unavoidable. There's no shortcut in the confusion, and we just have to come up with better ideas. And sometimes that's human nature. We make these mistakes, hopefully not as bad as in previous periods, because they were very bad.
So, can you name any titles then? If you're reading about the Martin Luther and the Reformation, any titles of books that come to your mind? Then I know you're talking about the historical period, but any specific books?
Any specific books?
Yes.
Oof. I tell you one.
Go ahead.
I tell you one book that I've read recently, which is kind of astonishing because it's about the first doomsday mythology in the world. The Mesopotamian, the Babylonian flood myth. The myth that the gods decided to destroy mankind by flooding the world, right? Which ended up eventually in the Bible, with Noah. An Oxford academic expert who looked into the tradition, what he discovered, and he wrote this a couple of years ago, that originally the earliest kind of cuneiform writings don't know anything about a global flood. They only know about some local floods, right?
Huh. Okay.
So originally, the earliest traditions in Mesopotamia about flooding, storms and flooding. So our discussion about hurricanes, right? They had them already 4,000 years ago. But these were local events. And of course, you can experience local flooding and local storms. They didn't have any idea about a global disaster. And a few hundreds later, someone came up with the idea to say, well, if there were these local floods, it must have been a global event.
Huh.
So he shows from the documents that originally they didn't have any idea of a global flood.
But it got exaggerated over time.
It got exaggerated, and of course it was the royal ideology and that is part of the thing, that the gods decided to prevent future flooding by installing kingdom. Kingship. Right?
To safeguard the population.
That book I read recently, and that was quite an eye-opener.
And do you recall the title? I'm just pressing you on this because it's an interesting story, but I'm just
the primordial flood disaster, the primordial flood account or myth. Oxford University Press, I think. As I said, it is about the earliest documentary evidence for flood stories and flood events, and it's a very kind of, it's not a popular book. It's for the expert, but it's revealing because for the first time it shows that the earliest traditions don't know anything about. And you see, the geologists today, or some of them, they say that there must be some kind of big flood behind this mythology. There must be some kind of big, and they come up with all these, geological theories how it could have happened. No one has thought that this is just an invention by the kind of Babylonian James Hansen, who comes up with a
Babylonian James Hansen. There was those poor people. Bill McKibben lived in Babylon. That's terrible. I'm so sorry for them. So let's conclude. My guest again has been Benny Peiser. He's the director of Net Zero Watch. You can find out more about him at netzerowatch.com. So Benny, this has been sobering, but I have to ask you, this is a question I ask all my guests. What gives you hope? What are you optimistic about now, given all of the challenges that you're facing in Europe, and there are significant ones, and this conflict is maybe just in the beginning days, and it could lead to wider conflict. What makes you optimistic? Because I had a pit in my stomach last night when I saw the attack on the nuclear plant in Ukraine. What gives you optimism?
What gives me hope? First of all, that you have to have this kind of historical perspective to realize that shit happens. That's part of history. Second, that is the lesson of history, isn't it? I like that summary too. Shit happens. Whereas one guy said the story of history is we went in, we kicked ass, and we took over. That's the other summary of history. Yeah. And the other, I think, hopeful situation is that Russia actually is a basket case, is a declining culture. It has a demographic problem. They don't have many young men. If you look at the videos of their soldiers, a lot of them are middle-aged guys. They don't have a lot of young recruits. It's a very aging, declining society. They're desperate. All they have is oil and gas and coal. That's all they have. Some people say it's just a gas station. They are dangerous because a dictator is leading them into what I think will be his Waterloo. I don't think he will win this conflict, but he will destroy a lot in the meantime. And it will be a wake-up call for Europeans to get back to reality and wake up from their utopian green dreams.
Utopian or dystopian?
Both. Dystopian in that, they claim, doomsday is nigh, but utopian in thinking that renewable energy can power Europe. That's utopian.
We'll stop there. Benny Peiser is my guest. He's at Net Zero Watch, netzerowatch.com. I highly recommend you follow his work. It's really remarkable, and he sends out a daily email blast with headlines from Europe about what's going on there. Benny, many thanks for being on the Power Hungry podcast.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
And to all of you in podcast land, tune in for the next episode of the Power Hungry podcast. Until then, see ya.